translator trying to create a bridge so that their profound insights might benefit the neurotic Western psyche. I've never lived in the environments in which the Native American conception of Wetiko arose. Pre-Columbian woodlands and plains, wild waters full of creatures in their spirit forms, vast herds of game galloping across wind-blown grasses. I'm a child of cities, machines, and Western civilization. As such, I experienced Wetiko in a typical dysfunctional American family, in a practically insane Western capitalist society. I thus bring new paradigm, Western symbolic logic, and intellectual formulations to construct from another culture. I do so with humility, respect, and the recognition that from one point of view, I could be seen to be appropriating a concept without knowing its original existential basis and phenomenology. From my perspective, I'm writing about the indigenous idea of Wetiko to honor the great native traditions of wisdom. In a sense, my work on Wetiko is a collaboration between me and unknown Native American philosophers, psychologists, and shamans. They lived in a world of tight communities and mutual responsibility for daily survival. In harmony with nature, they had no cares, they had no cars, or mass weaponry, or stock markets, or telecommunications. But they were humans like us. They too had to deal with the ins and outs of the human psyche. They fought wars and dealt with psychosis, crime, evil, and people of the lie. They had to protect themselves and their societies. When dark forces arose within the group, they had to identify them and know what could be handled and transmuted by the tribe and what was so toxic that it needed to be exiled for the safety of the rest. Their shamans and medicine women and men understood the nature of demons, possession, and evil in a way that could be most instructive for modern humanity. They provide us with a brilliant diagnosis as well as an urgent warning. The followers of the Buddhist path can't monopolize or copyright the idea of Buddha nature, for they are pointing at something that is intrinsic to the living experience of being a human being. In the same way, what the Native American wisdom holders are illuminating in their conception of Wetiko is a universal archetypal experience that is an essential aspect of our experience of being human. The Native American conception of Wetiko can add to, complement, and flesh out the articulation of this same malady by other spiritual traditions. In describing Wetiko, the Creed described giants that grow with each human meal, so they are simultaneously huge and emaciated, never able to fill their inner void, searching desperately for their next victim, driven by excess. In coming across the Native American idea and description of Wetiko, I recognized it in my own life as well as within my own mind. I have no doubt whatsoever that what the Native Americans refer to as Wetiko is a universal condition afflicting everyone. It is something we are all fated to come to terms with in our lives. What is Wetiko really? Wetiko is a cannibalizing force driven by insatiable greed, appetite without satisfaction, consumption as an end in itself, and war for its own sake against other tribes, species, and nature, and even against the individual's own humanity. It is a disease of the soul, and being a disease of the soul, we all potentially have Wetiko, as it pervades and informs the underlying field of consciousness. Any one of us at any moment can fall into our unconscious and unwittingly become an instrument for the evil of Wetiko to act itself out through us and incarnate in our world. If we see someone who seems to be taken over by Wetiko and we think they have the disease and we don't, and seeing them as separate, we have fallen under the spell of the virus ourselves. Wetiko induces in us a proclivity to see the source of our own pathology outside of ourselves existing in the other. Wetiko feeds off of polarization and fear and terror of the other. Seeing the world through a Wetiko-inspired lens of separation, otherness, enlivens what Jung calls the god of terror who dwells in the human soul, and simultaneously plays itself out both within our soul and in the world at large. Wetiko subversively turns out our genius for reality creation against us in such a way that we become bewitched by the projective tendencies of our own mind. Falling under Wetiko's spell, we become entranced by our own intrinsic gifts and talents for dreaming up our world in a way that not only doesn't serve us, but rather is put at the service of Wetiko, whose agenda is contrary to our own. Our creativity then boomerangs against us such that we hypnotize ourselves with our creative genius, which cripples our evolutionary potential. To the extent we are unconsciously possessed by the spirit of Wetiko, it is as if a psychic tapeworm or parasite has taken over our brain and tricked us, its host, into thinking we are feeding and empowering ourselves while we are actually nourishing the parasite, a process that will ultimately kill its host, us. In Wetiko disease, something that is not us surreptitiously beneath our conscious awareness takes the place of and plays the role of who we actually are, shape-shifting so as to cloak itself in our form. This mercurial predator gets under our skin and puts us on as a disguise. Miming ourselves, we become a copy, a false duplicate of our true selves. We are then truly playing out a real version of the imposter syndrome, the sickness of exploitation. Wetiko is powerless to control our true nature, but it can control and manipulate this false identity that it sets up within us. When we fall under the sway of Wetiko's illusion, we simultaneously identify with who we are not, while disassociating from and forgetting who we actually are, giving away our power, not to mention ourselves. In the process, to quote radical psychiatrist R.D. Laing, we have been conned into the illusion that we are separate, skin-encapsulated egos, having at one at the same time lost ourselves and developed the illusion that we are autonomous egos. We are expected to comply by inner consent with external constraints to an almost unbelievable extent. Disconnecting from our own intrinsic agency, we open ourselves to be used, manipulated, and exploited by outside forces. Indigenous author Jack Forbes, who wrote the classic book about Wetiko entitled Columbus and Other Cannibals, refers to Wetiko as a sickness of exploitation. Wetiko can be conceived of as being an evil, cannibalistic vampire spirit that inspires people under its sway to take and consume another's resources and life force energy solely for their own profit, without giving anything of value back from their own lives. Wetiko thus violates the sacred law of reciprocity in both human affairs and the natural world as a whole. Wetiko, like any virus, is fundamentally dead matter, and like a vampire, it has a thirst for the very thing it lacks, the essence of our soul, our very life force. A member of the undead, the vampiric Wetiko virus takes on and mimics life itself. It is only in and through a living being that it acquires a pseudo-life. The person so taken over becomes an outpost for Wetiko to do its dirty work. The raison d'etre for viruses like Wetiko is to continually reproduce themselves. The Wetiko virus isn't able to replicate itself through its own energy. However, so it's compelled to use us to propagate itself so that we can pass on and transmit the bug to others. The main channel of Wetiko's transmission is relational. It exists through our relationships with ourselves, each other, and the world at large. Like a vampire that can stand the light of day, the Wetiko virus can't stand to be illumined. However, in seeing how it covertly operates through our own unconsciousness, we take away its seeming independence, autonomy, and power over us, while at the same time empowering ourselves. The way the vampiric Wetiko covertly operates within the human psyche is mirrored by the way it works in the outside world. speaking about the genocide and colonization that the Europeans perpetrated on the Native Americans. Indigenous author and therapist Eduardo Duran writes in Healing the Soul Wound, the colonial process experienced by these people, the native people, can be described as a collective raping process of the psyche soul of both the land and the people in essence. The vampire bit the life world known as Turtle Island, as the Western Hemisphere is known in native cosmology, and the infection of the poison injected by the vampire has not been eradicated. Jung never tired of warning us that the greatest danger threatening humanity today is the possibility that millions, even billions of us can fall into our unconscious together in a collective psychosis, reinforcing each other's madness in such a way that we become unwittingly complicit in creating our own destruction. When this occurs, humanity finds itself in a situation where we are confronted with and battered by the primordial, and elemental forces of our own psyche. The internal origins of Wetiko is that, ultimately speaking, it involves the ascent of our own free will. No one other than ourselves is ultimately responsible for our situation. There is no objective entity called Wetiko that exists outside of ourselves that can steal our soul. The dreamed-up phenomenon of Wetiko tricks us into giving it away ourselves. People under the sway of Wetiko are implicated in and willingly subscribe to their own enslavement. They do this to the point that when offered the way out of the comfort of their prison, they oftentimes react violently. They symbolically and sometimes literally try to kill the messenger who is showing them the path to freedom. Ultimately speaking, in Wetiko disease, we are not being infected by a physical, objectively existing virus outside of ourselves. Rather, the origin and genesis of the Wetiko psychosis is endogenous. Its roots are to be found within the human psyche. The fact that Wetiko is the expression of something inside of us means that the cure for Wetiko is likewise within us. Though not objectively existing, the Wetiko pathogen has a virtual reality that nevertheless can influence us in such a way that it can potentially destroy our species. The fact that something that only exists as a function of ourselves can destroy us is pointing at and introducing us to the incredibly vast, invisible, and yet mostly untapped creative power that is our inherent birthright. If not used consciously, however, this creative power turns destructive. Wetiko can be likened to the darkness, which in this example can symbolize the ignorance that is characteristic of Wetiko. In a room where there is no sunlight, as long as there is no light, this darkness seems like a real thing. And yet once again, we open the blinds and sunlight, symbolic of awakening, pours into the room. The darkness is in the same moment evicted and exists no longer, as if it never existed in the first place. After the light has emerged, we can contemplate the darkness from the point of view of it being nothing other than the absence of light. And yet before the coming of the light, the darkness has real effects, meeting every criteria for being real in and of itself. I think of Jung's idea that in the realm of psyche something is real if it works, i.e. has real effects. This is the paradox as compared to existing by virtue of some quality. Wetiko only exists by the lack of virtue of not realizing our own nature. Wetiko is non-local in that it is an inner disease of the soul that discloses itself through the canvas of the outside world. This mind virus has the seemingly magical ability to extend itself out into the world and configure outer events to give itself living material form. Not constrained by the conventional laws of third-dimensional space and time, Wetiko non-locally informs events in the world as well as our reactions to them, so as to synchronistically express and reveal itself. Just like in a dream, events in the outer world are symbolically reflecting back to us a condition deep within the psyche of each one of us. Recognizing this correlation helps us begin to develop the vision to see Wetiko. If we don't understand that our current world crisis has its roots within and is an expression of the human psyche, we are doomed to unconsciously repeat and continually recreate endless suffering and destruction in increasingly amplified forms. as if we are having a recurring nightmare. In my language, the inner situation within ourselves is getting dreamed up into materialized form and through and as the world. In waking life, we are continually dreaming right beneath the threshold of consciousness, especially when we are under the influence of our unconscious complexes. In other words, when we are under the influence of our activated unconscious, we will unknowingly recreate our very inner landscape via the medium of the outside world. What can be more dreamlike than that? What is happening in the world today is reflecting and both literally and symbolically revealing to us something unknown within our own psyche, at the same time in a non-linear, a causal feedback loop that happens both temporally and over time. Events in our world are informed and shaped by the very inner psychological process they are reflecting. The inner and outer are simultaneously co-arising and reciprocally co-evoking each other. This is to say that what is happening within us and what is arising in our world have a mysterious interconnection. The inner and the outer are ultimately not separate nor separable. Recognizing the correlation between the inner and the outer, between the micro and the macro, is the doorway into being able to see Wetiko and wake up in the dreamlike nature that Wetiko is simultaneously hiding and revealing depending on our point of view and level of awareness. When we realize that we, as microcosms, mirror the macrocosm that reveals to us that there is a pathway inside of us that leads not to our particular psychological idiosyncrasies, but to what is truly important. Recognizing the connection between what is happening out in the world with what is taking place within our minds becomes a channel or secret doorway that leads beyond our merely personal psychological issues, empowering us to deal with the essential problem of our time. Dreaming Wetiko. The Wetiko psychosis is a dreamed up phenomenon, which is to say that we are all potentially participating in and actively co-creating the Wetiko epidemic in each and every moment. Like a collective dream, the Wetiko epidemic is the manifestation of something in our shared collective unconscious taking on material form. Wetiko is literally demanding that we pay attention to the fundamental role that the psyche plays in creating our experience of ourselves and of the world. Forgetting the crucial role that the psyche plays in creating our experience, we marginalize our own intrinsic authority, tragically dreaming up both internal and external authoritarian forces to limit our freedom and mold our experience for us. Never before in all of human history has our species been forced to confront the numinous world-transforming powers of the psyche on so vast a scale. Even with the ongoing multiple catastrophes that are converging in our world, it is not beyond the bounds of possibility that the darkness that is emerging today might become the soil out of which a regenerative age and nobler culture arise. Although the source of humanity's inhumanity to itself, Wetiko is at the same time a potential catalyst for our evolution as a species. Recognizing the dreamed up nature of the Wetiko epidemic can become the impetus for us to awaken to the dreamlike nature of the universe itself. We are Wetiko's offspring, and that this peculiar disease helps to grow a new part of us, potentially raising us to a higher level of our evolution, if it doesn't kill us in the process. Instead of the perspective of linear causality, where one thing causes another, to wrap our mind around the nature of the situation with which we are dealing necessitates we implement bidirectional thinking simultaneously in two directions. In a circular process without beginning or end, we are being dreamed up by the universe while dreaming up the universe at one and the same time. To see this not only demands that we have an expansion of consciousness, it is the very expansion itself. The less Wetiko is recognized, however, the more seemingly powerful and dangerous it becomes. Wetiko can only be seen when we begin to realize the dreamlike nature of our universe, step out of the illusory viewpoint of the separate self, and recognize the deeper underlying field of which we are all expressions, in which we are all contained, and through which we are all interconnected. These are interrelated insights of the same multifaceted realization. The energetic expression of this realization and the Wetiko dissolver par excellence is compassion. Connecting with the compassion that is our nature, we find ourselves in very good company. Being the unmediated expression of recognizing the dreamlike nature, compassion reciprocally coalesces with lucidity. In other words, if we're genuinely awakening to the dreamlike nature of reality, both lucidity and compassion will be inseparably united components of our experience. As if an instrument of a higher intelligence, Wetiko literally makes that demands that we become conscious of and step into our intrinsic creative power and agency, or suffer the consequences, instead of mutating so as to become resistant to our attempts to heal it. The Wetiko virus forces us to mutate, to evolve relative to it. Wetiko is a quantum phenomenon in that it contains within itself the potential to be either the deadliest poison or the most healing medicine. Will Wetiko destroy us, or will it catalyze our evolution and wake us up? How Wetiko ultimately manifests depends upon nothing other than whether we recognize what is revealing to us how dreamlike the very thing that is potentially killing us is at the same time helping us to remember who we are. How Wetiko manifests depends upon how we dream it. Before discovering the native term Wetiko, I was calling this pathological aberration of the psyche malignant egophrenia, whose acronym is ME disease. For when all is said and done, Wetiko stems from our misidentification of who we think we are, our sense of me-ness. In a very real sense, we are not who we believe ourselves to be if we experience ourselves as a separate self who exists separate from other imagined separate selves, not to mention the whole rest of the universe. From this misguided thought springs a case of mistaken identity, out of which grows the pestilence of Wetiko. Goldsmithing. In writing this book, I've had to navigate the conundrum of not wanting to repeat what was said in my earlier book on the same subject, while still giving the reader a real sense of the profundity of Wetiko in case they haven't read that earlier work. Here with this book, I want to give as much of a picture of Wetiko in case this is the